Hi, welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to Education with Ellie. Today we're going to be reviewing the oral cavity and we're going to be focusing on the muscles of the oral cavity, also talking about the nerves of the tongue, and kind of just giving like a big overview of everything going on inside the mouth. Okay, so first let's talk about boundaries. So the oral cavity extends from the lips to the oropharynx. So in the back of the mouth where the oral cavity becomes the pharynx after the arches deep in the mouth. And we're going to talk about those arches over here. So let's talk about those first. So actually first let's talk about some terminology. So it's helpful to know terminology or word roots because that will allow you to understand what the muscles are, where they go to, why they're named the way they're named. So genio means chin. Milo means molar. Palato means palate. Hyo means hyoid bone. Glosso means tongue, and stylo means styloid process. Okay, now that we've established some basic terminology about the oral cavity, we're going to move on to the looking into the mouth. So first thing you're going to see is this right here, and this is the tongue. This is a pretty crude drawing, but you get the idea. Now this area between the lips and the arches, there's this outpocketing, and that is the vestibule of the oral cavity. And that is, if you put your tongue into your cheek, you can see like an outpatching, and that's the vestibule. Okay. Now, if you follow that along the wall, you have your hard palate on top of the mouth. So this is an anterior, posterior drawing. You have your hard palate, it becomes your soft palate, and then you have your uvula. So this is a sagittal cut here. So you have the hard palate in the front, here, and then you have the soft palate, and then you have the uvula. Okay, so here's the uvula in this drawing. And then you can see the soft palate on like this upper part of the wall. So this first arch right here, let me do this in a different, right here, these arches would be the palatoglossal arches. And then deep to that, or more posterior, you would have the palatopharyngeal arches. And you know that's palatopharyngeal because it's between the palate, which is this upper region, and then the pharynx, which is back here. So now that we've established that, we can go on to talking about the tongue. So the tongue is a kind of weirdly shaped structure. These little dots here that line the more like posterior region, it forms a V, and it's called the valate papillae. And they form a V that demarcates the posterior from the anterior aspect of the tongue. So this is the posterior 1/3, and this is the anterior 2/3, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this next part. So you have the anterior 2/3, posterior 1/3. Now, the posterior 1/3 has the glossopharyngeal nerve, providing both taste and general sensation. And this is, if you remember from my last video, cranial nerve number 9. In terms of in the anterior 2/3, you have taste being provided by the chorda tympani of cranial nerve 7, which is the facial, and you have general sensation being provided by the lingual nerve of the mandibular branch of cranial nerve 5. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the muscles of around the oral cavity. So we have these muscles here called the chin strap muscles, and these guys form a kind of chin strap underneath the mandible. So first we have the anterior belly of the digastric, and this one is innervated by cranial nerve 5, branch 3. If you remember that, that's the lingual branch that goes down and does this, and it depresses the mandible. Now there's a posterior belly, and that's going to be doing the second half of the heavy lifting because there's a tendon in between. So the posterior belly is doing elevation of the hyoid, and innervated by cranial nerve 7. Okay, but back to the chin strap muscles. Then you have the mylohyoid, and the mylohyoid is also innervated by cranial nerve V3, or 5-3, the mandibular branch of cranial nerve 5. And the mylohyoid both depresses the mandible plus elevates the hyoid. And a special function is that it elevates the floor of the mouth. And I know this one is the one that elevates the floor of the mouth because mylo means molar, and molars are in your mouth. So you can just think of molars pulled and mouth goes up. Next, you have the geniohyoid. Genio, so it's chin to hyoid. So chin to hyoid would make sense that that muscle is elevating the hyoid, depressing the mandible. And because it's towards the back of because it's towards the front, if you look at a chin like pointing up like this, with like the body of the mandible being this part, you would see the anterior belly of the digastric kind of going like this. Then you would see the mylohyoid with horizontal striations, and then deep to both of those you would see the geniohyoid, so going from the chin to the hyoid. So you can imagine that would be depressing the mandible. It would also be elevating the hyoid, and finally it'd be widening the pharynx, because you're opening your mouth. And that's going to be, this is kind of a weird one. It's going to be innervated by cranial nerve, or sorry, not cranial nerve, cervical spinal nerve 1 off of cranial nerve 12. It's hypoglossal. Okay, and then finally we have cranial nerve 12, hypoglossal, and this is innervating the genioglossus, and this is going to depress plus protrude the tongue. Okay. Moving on, we have the muscles directly of the tongue. So all the muscles that are directly of the tongue end in glossus. So we have the hyoglossus. So this is going from the hyoid to the glossus. This is going to be innervated by cranial nerve 12. All of these are done by cranial nerve 12, except for the palatal-glossus, which is done by cranial nerve 9, which is the glossopharyngeal. And if you saw my last video, you know all about this. So the hyoglossus would do depression plus retraction of the tongue. The palatal-glossus does elevation of the posterior 1/3 of tongue. The styloglossus, the genioglossus, we just went over depression plus protrusion of tongue. And the styloglossus does the styloglossus. What does the styloglossus do? Elevation and posterior, depression, retraction, depression, protrusion. Oh yeah. It does retraction of the tongue. Plus makes trough to swallow. Okay. So after that, we're just going to go over quickly these two trios. And this is really helpful if you're in an anatomy lab and you're trying to identify these things in a prosection or a cadaver. So, for example, the nerve so there's a trio here. And you can see this best more like posterior because it's going from the styloid process, which is all the temporal bone, to like the hyoid bone right here. So if you have the stylohyoid, you're going to have something running like this. And that is going to be running with the hypoglossal nerve. That's cranial nerve 12. That's going on like the floor of the mouth. And it's also going to be running with the tendon of the digastric muscle. So if you see the tendon of the digastric, here's the anterior belly, here's the posterior belly. You see that hypoglossal nerve, and then you also see the stylohyoid. Then that's trio 1. And then trio 2 is more like, you can see it more posterior from like a sagittal view, but also if you have a butterfly cut prosection, then you're able to see it with arches. The styloglossus is running from the styloid to the tongue, and that's gonna be like this. And then you're gonna have the palatal-glossus, which the palatal-glossus is like behind the palatal-glossal arch. So I'm just going to pretend like that's behind. But that's important because there's a stylopharyngeus, which is from the styloid to the palatopharyngeal arch. So it's going to go to the back here, the stylopharyngeus. And then where it's running, there's going to be the glossopharyngeal nerve that runs with it, and that's cranial nerve 9. So that's basically all the information that I wanted to review about the oral cavity. I feel like that was pretty comprehensive. Oh yeah, and the last thing is that if you're looking in a model, you're going to see horizontal striations for the mylohyoid, and then vertical striations for the geniohyoid. And then the genioglossus is like, if you cut the tongue down the middle, you can see it the best. It looks like a fan like structure, like this. And then the anterior ability of the digastric is like if you have your thumbs pointing back and you have your fingers wrapped around like that. So imagine pointing your thumbs back like that. It underneath your chin. Like that. You would have this like kind of these lines pointing backwards. And that would be the direction that the anterior ability of the digastric is going, or the striations. Okay, thank you so much for tuning in to this lesson on the oral